There's something very strange about the new Black Myth, Zhong Kui gameplay. The game is called Zhong Kui. We've already seen Zhong Kui, we know what he looks like, and yet for most of these 15 minutes, we're not playing as him. Instead, we're controlling this white-robed swordsman who uses sword techniques, supernatural abilities, and, most interestingly, ghosts. And if you're not Chinese, that last part may just look like another fantasy summoning mechanic, but it isn't random. I'm Chinese, and Zhong Kui is one of those characters almost everyone in China recognizes, even if most people couldn't tell you his complete story. You may have seen his face on old paintings, decorations, temples, or traditional prints without even knowing who he was. And once you understand what Zhong Kui represents in Chinese culture, a lot of the strange things game science is showing suddenly start to make sense. Why the ghosts follow him, why he looks almost like a monster himself, why he's riding a tiger, why a game named after him might not even let you play as him. And, most importantly, why choosing Zhong Kui gives game science much more freedom than choosing Sun Wukong. So before we break down the gameplay, let me give you the Chinese cultural context that this trailer never explains. First, how do you even say his name? His name is written with 2 characters. In Mandarin, it's pronounced roughly Zhong Kui. And there's another translation problem we need to get out of the way immediately. English articles often call him Zhong Kui, the demon queller. That's convenient. But it also oversimplifies Chinese mythology. Because Chinese supernatural vocabulary doesn't map perfectly onto English words like demon. We have words like guai, usually something closer to a ghost or spirit of the dead, yao, often a supernatural being, animal, plant, or object that has transformed or cultivated power, mo, something closer to a demonic or corrupting force, and shen, a god, deity, divine spirit, or powerful supernatural being. And those categories are not always clean. A being can change status. Something frightening is not automatically evil. A ghost is not necessarily a demon, and a monster is not necessarily the villain. That distinction is extremely important for understanding Chinese fantasy, and I suspect it's going to be extremely important for Black Myth, Zhong Kui, because Zhong Kui's job is not simply kill every supernatural creature. His relationship with ghosts is much more complicated than that. So who is Zhong Kui? The easiest explanation for Western viewers would probably be Zhong Kui is China's legendary demon hunter, but that makes him sound like Chinese Geralt of Rivia, and that's not really accurate. Zhong Kui is part ghost hunter, part exorcistic protector, part folk deity, part scholar, and in later traditions, sometimes almost a supernatural official. He's associated with driving away evil spirits, protecting households, and suppressing harmful supernatural forces. But here's what makes him so different from Sun Wukong. Zhong Kui doesn't have one definitive canon. Sun Wukong has Journey to the West. If you've played Black Myth Wukong, you can literally go back to that novel and identify characters, locations, relationships, and entire story arcs. Zhong Kui doesn't work like that. There is no single ancient book called The Adventures of Zhong Kui that gives us the official version of his life, his identity accumulated over centuries. Stories, paintings, folk religion, festivals, opera, popular literature, different historical periods kept adding new details. So when someone tells you, this is the true origin story of Zhong Kui, be careful, there are multiple traditions. And that's actually one of the smartest things about game science choosing him. With Wukong, millions of people already have a very specific idea of who Sun Wukong is. With Zhong Kui, game science has much more empty space to work with. Here's one cultural difference that I think international players should understand. For Chinese people historically, Zhong Kui wasn't only someone who appeared in fantasy stories, his image itself could be protective. Traditionally, paintings and prints of Zhong Kui were displayed in homes to ward off harmful influences. You could literally have this terrifying bearded man hanging in your house because the idea was basically, if evil spirits come here, this is the guy waiting for them. And yes, Zhong Kui is associated with Chinese festivals too. His image was historically connected with the Lunar New Year, when households wanted to drive away bad fortune and begin the year safely. He also became strongly associated with the 5th day of the 5th lunar month, the Dragon Boat Festival. That festival isn't only about eating zongzi and racing dragon boats. Traditionally, that time of year was also connected with disease prevention, poisonous creatures, and warding off harmful forces, so people used things like mugwort, calamus, and protective images, and Zhong Kui fit perfectly into that role. He's basically supernatural pest control, except the pests are ghosts, disease, and evil influences. And that's why his face looks so terrifying. If you're looking at Zhong Kui and thinking, wait, why does the good guy look more terrifying than half the demons? That's kind of the point. Zhong Kui is traditionally depicted as ugly, fierce, and intimidating, huge beard, powerful eyes, an aggressive expression, official-looking clothing, a sword. Sometimes he almost looks like a ghost himself. And that contrast is fundamental to his appeal. He looks frightening, but he's the one protecting you from things that are worse. It's a very different visual idea from the beautiful, radiant, angelic protector you might expect from some Western religious art. With Zhong Kui, the thing protecting you from monsters may also look monstrous. Keep that idea in mind because that boundary between appearance and morality becomes very important in his legends. One of the most influential Zhong Kui stories is connected to Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang dynasty. The story says the emperor became seriously ill, then he had a dream. In that dream, a small ghost was causing trouble. Suddenly, a much larger and more terrifying figure appeared. He seized the smaller ghost, overpowered it, and ate it. That huge figure identified himself as Zhong Kui. After the emperor woke up, his illness disappeared. The emperor then ordered the famous painter Wu Daozi to paint the figure he had seen in his dream. And this story became enormously influential in shaping Zhong Kui as the terrifying supernatural protector. But there's an important historical detail here. The story is set during the Tang dynasty. That doesn't mean we have a perfectly preserved Tang biography proving all of this happened. The Zhong Kui tradition comes to us through later written records and centuries of retelling. Again, legend, folklore, and history are layered together, which is exactly the kind of material game science loves to work with. Then there's the other famous Zhong Kui story. This is probably the origin story many Chinese people today have heard in one form or another. Zhong Kui was originally a human scholar. He was extremely intelligent. He entered the imperial examination system, essentially the incredibly competitive system through which educated men could enter government service in imperial China. And this is another thing that may need explanation for international viewers. Passing these examinations wasn't like passing a normal school test. For centuries, the imperial examination system could determine your entire social future. Success could bring status, government office, and honor to your family. Failure could mean years, sometimes decades, of studying for nothing. So, in later Zhong Kui stories, he performs brilliantly, but because he is extremely ugly, he is denied the recognition or position he deserves, and Zhong Kui is furious, humiliated by the injustice, he kills himself. After his death, however, his story doesn't end. He eventually becomes the one who hunts and controls ghosts. Think about that transformation. A man rejected by the official human system becomes an official-like authority in the supernatural world. The man who was judged becomes the judge. That is an incredibly powerful story, and even if game science completely rewrites the details, that theme alone gives them a lot to work with. Now, something important, Zhong Kui is not just the Chinese god of hell. This is another misconception I expect international audiences to have. Chinese mythology doesn't have one simple equivalent of Satan rules hell. The Chinese underworld is much more bureaucratic. Different traditions contain different judges, kings, officials, messengers, and supernatural authorities. You may have heard of Yanluo Wang, the king of hell. You may have seen Oxhead and Horseface, Black and White Impermanence, the 10 kings of the underworld. There is a huge supernatural bureaucracy in Chinese religious imagination and folklore. Zhong Kui can be connected to this world in later popular traditions, and he's often given official or judge-like qualities, but saying Zhong Kui is the ruler of Chinese hell would be wrong. His most recognizable function is much closer to catching, suppressing, and commanding ghosts and evil spirits. And that difference matters, because he's not sitting on a throne waiting for dead people to arrive. He goes out looking for trouble. And he doesn't just kill ghosts. Now we can finally return to the gameplay, because this is the detail that immediately stood out to me. Traditional Zhong Kui paintings often show him with an entire group of little ghosts, and they're not fighting him, they're working for him. Some carry objects, some carry lanterns, some escort him, some perform ridiculous tasks. Sometimes they're basically his supernatural employees. There are even famous paintings of Zhong Kui traveling with an entire bizarre ghostly entourage, and Chinese artists didn't always treat these scenes as terrifying. Some are surprisingly funny. There's even a long tradition of stories and paintings involving Zhong Kui marrying off his sister. Imagine this terrifying demon hunter, completely drunk, being carried around by his ghost servants while participating in a family wedding procession. That's also Zhong Kui. And this is worth understanding because Chinese supernatural folklore can switch between horror, religion, satire, comedy, and everyday life without seeing those categories as contradictory. A ghost can be terrifying in one story and comic relief in another. Now look at the gameplay again. Suddenly the small ghosts in this trailer don't feel random anymore. We see ghost-like creatures assisting the player. They appear to be summoned into combat, and at one point the player seems capable of controlling or inhabiting one of them. Game science has not confirmed some giant Pokemon-style ghost collection system. We don't know whether every ghost can be captured. We don't know whether they have levels. We don't know whether we build a permanent team. So I'm not saying that's definitely the system. But culturally, the idea makes perfect sense because Zhong Kui's relationship with ghosts isn't simply destroy them, it's also subdue them, command them, put them to work. Think about how Black Myth Wukong adapted mythology into gameplay. Sun Wukong is famous for transformation, so transformation became one of the game's signature mechanics. Zhong Kui is famous for controlling supernatural beings. So what if the equivalent system here becomes defeat a ghost, subdue it, summon it, use its ability, or perhaps even possess it? Now we're starting to see how Zhong Kui could have its own mechanical identity. But then we have a huge problem, because the character doing all of this doesn't seem to be Zhong Kui. The playable character throughout most of this footage is a younger man in white. He uses a sword, he performs supernatural techniques, he interacts with ghosts. Meanwhile, the giant bearded Zhong Kui we've already seen appears separately. So who are we actually playing as? And this is where international players should remember something game science already did once. Black Myth Wukong is named after Sun Wukong, but for most of the game you don't play as Sun Wukong, you play as the Destined One. So Black Myth Zhong Kui does not necessarily mean you are Zhong Kui for the entire game. The title may describe the central mythology rather than the identity of the player character. Could this white-robed swordsman be Zhong Kui before his transformation? A disciple? Someone sent to find him? Another folkloric character? A completely original protagonist? Right now we don't know, and I think that's deliberately the biggest mystery in this footage. Now mechanically, let's not pretend game science threw everything away. You can see Black Myth Wukong underneath this game. Fast melee combat, dodging, abilities, resource management, large boss encounters, building resources through normal combat and spending them on stronger actions. The foundation is familiar. But the fighting language is different. Instead of Wukong's staff we have swordsmanship. We appear to have a stronger defensive or parry element. There are supernatural techniques that visually feel closer to Chinese ritual and magical imagery, and then you put the ghost mechanics on top. So I wouldn't call this Wukong with a sword, but I also wouldn't pretend it's a completely unrelated combat system. It looks more like game science is taking the action RPG grammar they already developed and applying a completely different mythological vocabulary to it. Swordsmanship, ghosts, exorcism, possession, maybe spirit control, that is where the new identity begins. There's another detail worth watching. During the giant clam-like boss fight, part of its shell appears to be physically destroyed. That raises the possibility of a more developed body part destruction system. If enemies have armor, horns, shells, or other structures that can actually be broken during combat, that could introduce another tactical layer. But I'm separating what we saw from what game science has confirmed. We saw a boss shell break. We have not seen confirmation of a universal monster hunter-style breakable part system. So for now, interesting, possibly important, but not confirmed. And then we have one of my favorite details, Zhong Kui riding a tiger. If you're an international viewer, you might reasonably assume game science just thought, big Chinese demon hunter plus giant tiger, cool, and yes, it is cool. But the image isn't completely invented for this game. Older East Asian artwork contains Zhong Kui imagery involving tigers, and the broader tradition is full of visual variations that go far beyond the modern stereotype of Zhong Kui simply standing there in a red robe holding a sword. That's another reason I keep emphasizing that there isn't one fixed Zhong Kui. Chinese artists have been remixing this character for centuries, and game science is just the newest group doing it. The unanswered question is what this particular tiger means. Companion, symbol, story character, actual mount? Can we ride it? No idea yet. But because it keeps appearing in promotional imagery, I doubt it's meaningless. Zhong Kui can also be funny. This is another cultural thing I'd love international players to understand. Please don't assume this game has to be 15 hours of dark underworld, dead children, blood, and depressing ghost stories, because traditional Zhong Kui art can be surprisingly playful. There's Zhong Kui drunk, Zhong Kui traveling, Zhong Kui surrounded by incompetent little ghosts, Zhong Kui attending family events, Zhong Kui portrayed almost like an eccentric scholar. Artists have repeatedly reinterpreted him depending on the period and purpose. So if game science suddenly gives us bizarre humor in the middle of all this horror, that wouldn't be betraying the character, it would actually fit the tradition surprisingly well. And if you played Wukong, you already know game science likes mixing tragedy with absurdity. Another thing international audiences may miss is the official-looking hat and robes often associated with Zhong Kui. That visual language matters in Chinese culture. He's not dressed like a wandering martial artist. He's often depicted with the visual vocabulary of a scholar official. And that creates this strange contradiction. The imperial system rejected him in some versions of the legend, yet he eventually appears dressed almost like an authority figure himself. He's outside the system, but he also looks like part of the system. Again, the rejected scholar becomes an enforcer. If game science decides to explore ideas about bureaucracy, justice, or corruption, Zhong Kui is an incredibly useful character for that. And Chinese mythology loves bureaucracy. This might sound funny to Western audiences, but it's genuinely useful context. A lot of traditional Chinese supernatural imagination mirrors human government. There are heavenly officials, local gods, city gods, underworld judges, registers, ranks, messengers, punishments, promotions, demotions, even supernatural paperwork depending on the story. The afterlife can sometimes feel less like Dante's Inferno and more like an enormous supernatural civil service. And that means a character like Zhong Kui isn't interesting simply because he is powerful enough to kill monsters. His position inside or outside that supernatural order can be just as important. Who gave him authority? Who decides what counts as a ghost that deserves punishment? What happens when the bureaucracy itself is corrupt? Those are questions that fit Black Myth extremely well. The world itself also looks different. Compared with Wukong, the atmosphere here immediately feels colder, cloudier, wetter, more muted, more uncomfortable. Black Myth, Wukong frequently loved dramatic sunlight. Golden landscapes, strong contrast, huge cinematic shafts of light. Zhong Kui seems much more willing to sit inside gray skies, fog, rain, and shadow. And for this subject, that feels right. Chinese ghost stories aren't always about entering a giant obvious hell dimension. Sometimes the supernatural is much closer. An abandoned road, an inn, a forest, a village at night, a stranger who doesn't seem quite right. A place where the boundary between the ordinary world and the ghost world becomes thin enough that you don't immediately realize you've crossed it. That's the atmosphere I want from a Zhong Kui game, not just welcome to hell, something quieter, something where you're never completely sure which side you're standing on. And what about the invisible walls? Then there's one of Wukong's most infamous problems, invisible walls. You see a path, it clearly looks accessible, you walk toward it and no. Game science has discussed improving this kind of environmental restriction, but international viewers should be careful with the conclusion. Fewer invisible walls does not automatically mean open world. The game could still use large interconnected regions or semi-open levels. What matters more is whether the physical world becomes easier to read. If a cliff blocks me, show me a cliff. If a wall blocks me, give me a wall. Don't show me a perfectly walkable forest path and then put an invisible force field in front of it. That alone would be a major improvement. And now we finally get to what I think is the biggest question. When Game Science announced this game, a lot of people asked, why Zhong Kui? Why not Wukong 2? Why not a DLC? Why choose a character most international players barely know? I think that's exactly why. Sun Wukong comes with an enormous amount of narrative baggage. You already know who he is. Even outside China, people have expectations. Zhong Kui gives Game Science access to another huge part of Chinese culture while giving them much more creative freedom. Ghost stories, folk religion, exorcism, the imperial examination system, scholar official culture, supernatural bureaucracy, the underworld, disease and protection, human beings becoming spirits, spirits working for humans. Appearance versus morality, and the question of who gets to decide what deserves punishment. That is an enormous toolbox. Who gets to call someone a monster? This is where Zhong Kui becomes really interesting to me. Remember his famous later origin story. Society looks at him. He's ugly, he's frightening. He doesn't fit the expected image, so despite his ability, he's rejected. The human world decides what he is worth based on what he looks like. Then he dies and becomes the guy who judges ghosts. Think about how perfect that is for a Black Myth story. The person who was unfairly judged becomes the judge. The person who looks like a monster protects people from monsters, and the creatures he hunts sometimes become his servants. So the central question doesn't have to be, can Zhong Kui defeat this demon? It could be, why is this creature considered a demon in the first place? Who's human? Who's a ghost? Who's evil? Who's simply ugly? Who's dangerous? Who's just been labeled dangerous? And who has the authority to decide? Now compare that with Sun Wukong. Wukong's natural question is, who has the right to control me? He rebels against authority. He challenges heaven. He breaks the rules. Zhong Kui potentially asks a different question, who has the right to judge me? Wukong challenges the system. Zhong Kui may force us to examine the system itself, and if game science actually goes in that direction, that's where I think Black Myth, Zhong Kui could become something genuinely special. Right now, there is still a massive amount we don't know. Who is the white-robed swordsman? Is Zhong Kui actually playable? How deep is the ghost system? Can spirits be collected? Can they be upgraded? Can different ghosts give you different abilities? Can Zhong Kui's tiger actually be ridden? Is boss body part destruction a real mechanic? How open are these maps? How important is parrying? What period of Chinese history is game science drawing from? And which version of the Zhong Kui legend are they actually using? That last question may be the most important one, because unlike Sun Wukong, there is no single answer they have to follow. So if you're watching Black Myth Zhong Kui from outside China, I wouldn't think of Zhong Kui as the new Chinese mythology protagonist after Sun Wukong. Think of him as something much stranger. A scholar who became a ghost hunter, a terrifying face used as a symbol of protection, a man who hunts ghosts but also commands them, a supernatural authority figure who may have once been destroyed by human authority. A character who can be horrifying in one painting and almost comedic in another, and a mythological figure Chinese artists and storytellers have already been reinventing for centuries. Game science isn't breaking a fixed Zhong Kui canon. There barely is one. They're entering a conversation that's been going on for hundreds of years. And that's why these 15 minutes are so interesting, because the question isn't just what can Zhong Kui do, the question is, what does game science think Zhong Kui means? And until we know who this white-robed swordsman is, I don't think we've even reached the real mystery yet. If you want more Black Myth Zhong Kui breakdowns from a Chinese perspective, including the mythology, Chinese community theories, historical references, and things that may get lost in translation, subscribe. Because as more of this game gets revealed, there are going to be a lot of details that make perfect sense to Chinese players, and almost no sense at all if nobody explains where they came from. But understanding who Zhong Kui is only the first layer, because in the new gameplay trailer, Game Science is already hiding a lot of very specific Chinese cultural references inside the combat. The paper talismans, the ritual hand gestures, the way the character channels fire into his sword, the strange scene where smoke is fanned into a room, and even that procession of ghosts that some viewers are already comparing to the Japanese Hayaki Yagyo, when there may actually be a much closer Zhong Kui reference in Chinese art. So in the next video, I'm going through the trailer scene by scene and explaining what these abilities and visual details mean from a Chinese cultural perspective, and also which interpretations are real historical references and which ones are probably just modern wuxia or fantasy influences. Because once you know what you're looking at, these don't feel like random fantasy spells anymore, they start to feel very Chinese. So if that sounds interesting, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next breakdown.